Thanks so much. Thank you, Chair Shanley and members of the committee. The aim of Bill 7736 is to add a tool to our legislative toolbox so that wherever we can, we assess the anticipated impacts of our legislation on communities that have traditionally been disadvantaged due to the unintended consequences of policies. Assessments such as fiscal notes and environmental impact reports are already tools for predicting the impacts of legislation. H7736 adds a race, ethnicity, gender, and disability impact statement to those resources that we already depend upon. We're all aware that policies often have unintended consequences that would be best addressed and considered prior to passage and adoption. Every legislative body in the country, on occasion, has passed legislation that has resulted in unintended negative consequences for women, Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities, as well as individuals with disabilities. Policy-driven disproportionate impacts have led to poor health outcomes, low educational attainment, and low socioeconomic levels. In turn, they've exacerbated increased rates of chronic health issues, justice system involvement, incarceration, increased public health risk, and increased involvement with state agencies and monitoring, resulting in disenfranchisement and distrust of systems and government. Starting in 2007 and 2008, a handful of states, including Connecticut and Massachusetts, began discussing and piloting the use of racial impact statements to address disparities in their criminal justice systems, along with the groundbreaking assistance of the Sentencing Project, whose work on impact statements has focused mainly on their use in criminal justice. Other states across the country have proposed and implemented impact statements as part of sector and statewide efforts to address disparities over the past 15 years. In 2019, Maine took a different approach and established the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations to examine systemic racial disparities and advise all three branches of government on public policy changes that would make racial equity a central consideration in their state's lawmaking. The legislation before you today aims to build on that foundation with a different but simpler approach, proposing the establishment of the combined race, ethnicity, gender, and disability impact statement to inform our policy debate and to improve the legislature's ability to avoid perpetuating disparities and to increase equity through better informed policy. This statement will be an impartial, simple, and understandable statement included in a section of the bill language, demonstrating that the bill sponsor has taken into account the impact, positive or negative, that legislation will have on historically disadvantaged communities. Bill sponsors may work in conjunction with state agencies to obtain any necessary demographic data to inform the content of the statement, which will include a description of how the legislation will or will not provide corrective actions for policies that have previously resulted in disparities by race, ethnicity, gender, and disability. It will include a reference to historic disparities and a reference to any existing efforts to address those disparities. The impact statements will be required when proposed legislation pertains to expenditures or policy regarding human services, medical, dental, or behavioral health care, disability services, housing or housing assistance, education, employment and labor, land use and transportation, economic and environmental policy, and policies pertaining to criminal justice. The impact statement requirement may be waived if there's no discernible impact based on race, ethnicity, gender, or disability. As we pursue equity in our systems and in our state, understanding that inequality has resulted in human and economic suffering, the impact statement is a step that we as legislators can take to assure that we are not perpetuating harmful disparities in our systems and policies. Thank you so much to all of you on the committee for consideration of the legislation, and I hope that you agree that this is a meaningful and reasonable step that we can take for sound and fair policy making. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Leader Filippi, do you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Kassar. On page 3, lines 21 and 22, it says the impact statement may be waived. Who may waive it?
If the bill sponsor can prove that there is no historically disadvantaged population being impacted, they can include in the bill a statement that we're waiving it because there is no history of inequity pertaining to this policy issue.
So if there is a history of inequity pertaining to the policy issue and the representative or senator doesn't include the statement, does the bill not get filed? Does it not get put into the hopper?
Yeah, I think it's up to the sponsor to make sure that that's included.
But if it's not?
If it's not, then we would look to the assistance of Ledge Counsel or other staff to help make sure that it's included.
Understand. I just think this isn't lawful because it.
I'm sorry, what?
I just don't think this is lawful. I understand what you're trying to do, and I think there's a way to do it without violating our state constitution, Article 6, because it seems
Can you
to.
explain Article 6?
Article 6 is the legislative power, and I think that you're putting a prior restraint on elected representatives, preventing them from putting in legislation or requiring them to take into account the impact of the legislation before they submit it. I think if this was drafted differently and it was handled like the impact statements that we have to do, the fiscal notes, the legislator doesn't have to educate themselves on the fiscal impact before they put in a bill. They should, but they don't have to because it's restraining a legislator's ability to file legislation, and I think that's unconstitutional to do. But if we had a bill that just said there should be a separate office, like we have fiscal staff that creates fiscal notes, and that separate office would create an impact statement on legislation that has already been submitted, I think that might pass muster, but I just don't think you can put this prior restraint on a legislator, requiring them to take into account what you're trying to have them take into account here, whether it's good, bad, whether they should or not, but I just don't think you can restrain them from submitting legislation.
That's an interesting observation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other members of the committee with questions or comments? Representative McGaugh.
Sorry, I guess I'm confused in listening to the conversation.
Can you just make sure the microphone is on?
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
A little bit better.
Okay. In your conversation, it just brought up some confusion for me. So I just want to be clear, who would be creating the notation?
So the bill sponsor would make sure that that information is available in the same way that a bill sponsor makes sure that the findings are available for a particular bill or the definitions. Sometimes they do that with the help of advocacy folks. Sometimes they do it with the help of legislative counsel. Sometimes they do it with the assistance of representatives from our state agencies. That information is simply intended to be a part of the bill that is submitted.
Okay. Thank you.
Any further questions or comments? Representative Nardone.
You brought up an interesting point where they'll look for a fiscal note and they'll get, are they mandated to do that?
A fiscal note?
Yeah,
I don't
I
have
don't
a
think
lot
they
of
are.
background on the fiscal notes per kind of what the
Right.
mandates are.
So when a legislator produces a bill, he doesn't have to come up with that information, he just submits a bill.
I think the fiscal note process goes through a request through the Committee on Finance.
Right, but it's not mandated.
I don't know about
Okay.
any mandates regarding the fiscal notes.
All right, thanks.
Well, I will say, in fact, that our laws require a fiscal note to be created, but you can't have that as a condition of submitting legislation. You know, our laws require it, but it's not followed here because I don't even know if the law can bind what we do as legislators. So I don't think
Sure.
that
Can I
we can
ask-
be bound
Sure,
by this.
Representative Nardone.
Since you're the attorney here, is it mandated that you do that, even though it requires it?
There's a general law that says a fiscal
Okay.
note shall be created for every bill, but
I'm in
it's not,
finance.
I
I
know
never
you're
see
in-
it.
There should be one presented. There's a law that says they need to be created for every bill, but it's a law that, frankly, I don't think is constitutional. And that's why it's not followed.
Representative Tanzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So would you be amenable to having it be taken into consideration by the committee, whether or not the person chooses to do that? So if they're not able to do it, and that's just a reflection of them when they come before the committee, it's almost, you know, they'll be, it's like if you're presenting in a, you know, professional place and you don't do the things you're supposed to do, points will be taken off. So, we can be taking that into consideration, or just not make it a requirement prior to it being submitted. Just having, we may need to have additional resources, but I think we can look to what our surrounding states have done in order to come up with a model that is suitable to our existing system, as well as our Constitution. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that we will work through this through the committee process,
Right.
and work through bills and understand what language is meaningful, right? We don't, there isn't a precedent for exactly how to do this. This is an opportunity for us to figure it out. Most folks who submit their legislation understand which communities are impacted.
Right.
So I think there's some really low-hanging fruit that can be harvested for a good number of our bills. But I think, yes, I'm open to figuring out how we can develop this so it's meaningful and helpful. The
Right.
point is to make a tool that's useful.
No, I absolutely understand. And this is the first time it's being presented before the committee, so,
Exactly.
all right. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
Any further questions or comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the committee for having me speak here today. Good afternoon, evening now, probably. My name is Wayona Nelson Davies. I'm the Executive Director of the Economic Progress Institute. I'm a former legal aid attorney with direct experience serving low-income and historically marginalized communities, with special focus on the effects of structural racism on communities of color and leading racial and health equity efforts. As our team at the Economic Progress Institute focuses on advancing equity in our own policy priorities, I am proud that this is my first testimony in this role as the Executive Director on behalf of EPI, in strong support of H 7736, which would require race, ethnicity, gender, and disability impact statements from most proposed legislation. We thank Representative Kaskar for her leadership on this issue and submitting this bill. We have also offered written testimony on behalf of this bill in support of it. We hear a lot about leading with equity, but sometimes we're not sure what this really means or where to even begin. This bill demonstrates what equity in policy, equity in leadership, and equity in action can look like. We are still dealing with the impact of a pandemic that revealed that disparities are interwoven into the fabric of our society. COVID-19 and history have shown that neutrality can be harmful and sometimes even deadly, as disparities have led to lower socioeconomic status, inadequate housing structures, environmental justice issues, food insecurity, higher rates of poverty, disproportionately and higher rates of incarceration, and poorer educational and health outcomes. Much legislation that appears to have nothing to do with equity can still worsen disparities. As lawmakers, you have awesome power to enact legislation and policies that mitigate disparities and that support all Rhode Islanders. Equity is not about special treatment. Leading with equity gets us to the all. It is making sure that all residents have the same opportunities. It is about developing sound and fair laws and policies. We simply cannot do this without taking a pause and acknowledging that there are roadblocks for some racial, ethnic, gender, and disabled communities. This bill sends a message that our leaders have considered the missteps of the past and are prepared to prevent harm going forward. 9 states have already taken the lead and implemented a requirement for racial impact statements for criminal justice legislation. 9 other states have introduced similar statements. Maine and Colorado have gone beyond criminal justice to include other policy areas. And to the point that was made earlier, we can contact these states to find out and make sure that we're able to do this without violating any laws, because they seem to have done it in their states. And I'm going to end with this. On February 3rd, 2022, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, during a webinar entitled Racial Equity, the Whole Government Responsibility, stated, and I quote, If we can legislate hurt and harm, inequity, and injustice, then we can legislate equity, healing, and justice. This bill presents our lawmakers in the state of Rhode Island the opportunity to make this a part of our legacy and become one of the pioneers of equity impact statements by showing that we chose to legislate equity, healing, and justice for all Rhode Islanders. The Economic Progress Institute would like to thank all of the co-sponsors for this vision, and we look forward to seeing this bill advance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions from members of the committee? Yes, Representative Felix.
Not so much a question, but just a comment. Just want to congratulate you on your new role and really look forward working with you and the agency on this and many other issues. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions or comments? Okay.
And while I'm up here, if I may, I would just like to say that we also support Representative Carado's bill requiring the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Opportunity to create and deliver annual trainings in cultural competency for all state and municipal employees.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Paige Clausius Parks, welcome back.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Rhode Island Kids Count would like to voice our strong support for H7736 and to thank Representative Kassar and all the many legislators who have co-sponsored this bill. For 27 years, Rhode Island Kids Count has published the Rhode Island Kids Count Fact Book, which provides a statistical portrait of Rhode Island children, and our Race and Ethnicity Disparities Indicator, which I have included in written testimony, tracks the gap that exists in economic, health, safety, and education outcomes for children of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Year after year, the data has shown large and unacceptable disparities by race, ethnicity, and disability. Rhode Island Kids Count supports efforts to develop policies that reduce and eliminate disparities, prevent the exacerbation of existing disparities, and allow policymakers to make data-informed decisions. Young children in Rhode Island are more likely to be identified as people of color than any other age group in our state. I included a chart in my written testimony that shows in 2019 in Rhode Island, 46% of our children under the age of 5 were people of color, compared to 35% of adults ages 25 to 44, and only 12% of adults 65 and over. Rhode Island's future is diverse, and this diversity is an incredible asset for all of us. Creating racially aware policies, especially those that impact our children, is imperative for a prosperous future for all of Rhode Island. Race statements are tools that assist lawmakers in analyzing and modifying proposed legislation. This is not a new concept, as you've heard already. Iowa was one of the first states to do this back in 2008. And as you've just heard in Wyona's testimony, 9 other states have also done this. To be most effective, race, ethnicity, gender, and disability impact statements should provide a thorough and comprehensive analysis of the impact of the proposed legislation using a standardized process and methodology, and it should be made publicly available to all stakeholders, including the constituents and advocates, and to do so early in the process, ideally before a bill is called for hearing. And legislation should also prohibit passage of bills that will increase disparities by race, ethnicity, gender, or disability. The mission of Rhode Island Kids Count is to improve the lives of our children and to work to eliminate those unacceptable disparities we see. And we know that this legislation strongly will help reach that mission. Happy to take any questions, and that will conclude my testimony.
Thank you very much. Any questions from members of the committee? Seeing none. Thank you again.
Thank you.